Hello, and welcome to Oxford at Home. I'm Ben Harwood, and along with my friends Tom and Greg, I'm usually behind the scenes of these broadcasts, but today, the last in our second series, is a special episode. It's special because our usual fantastic host, Professor Rana Mitter, is instead delivering today's talk. So, whilst you'll have heard Rana introduce 21 Oxford colleagues over our previous episodes, it's a great privilege for me to introduce him today as our 22nd speaker. Rana is the former director of our university's China Centre, Europe's largest centre for the study of China. He's a professor of history and politics of modern China, and he's a fellow of St. Cross College. He's also the author of several must-read, award-winning books, which we've linked to below the video, including Modern China, a very short introduction, China's War with Japan, The Struggle for Survival, and the book that today's talk will be based on, the intriguingly titled China's Good War, How World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism. In 2019, Rana gave an interview in which he said that many academic pursuits are clearly going to be a lifetime pursuit in terms of growing and enriching what you do, and many historians do spend many decades developing their craft in certain ways. Well, whilst we've only got around 15 minutes for Rana's talk today, and not decades, I am still hugely looking forward to hearing him speak on a subject that he has spent a lifetime studying. The title of today's talk is How China's Wartime History is Shaping a Nationalist Future Today. And with that, Rana, the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks very much indeed, Ben. And hello to everyone from Oxford at Home. And I hope it's not too disconcerting to our regulars to see me sitting in the speaker's chair, so to speak, rather than the host's chair. I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes today, as is our usual practice, and then looking forward to your questions and comments for 15 minutes or so after that. And I'm going to, for the first time in this series on my part, see if I can share my screen with you. Where are we? Yes, that's looking good. Okay. Fantastic. Well, what I'd like to do is to speak today, just make sure I'm properly timed, I'm literally at home. What I'd like to do today is to give you a sense of something that is, I think, under-examined when it comes to a phenomenon that we've been hearing a great deal about in recent days, months, and years, and that's China's nationalism. In other words, the idea that as China is a rising power in the world, and those of you who've been catching up on the news overnight will have seen that the United States and China got pretty heated with each other over the negotiations table in Anchorage, Alaska, just yesterday. So, you know, the idea of America and China squaring off in a sort of battle of the nations is very, very much part of the present geopolitical scenario. But when people analyze what underpins that nationalism, what underpins that sense of national identity and its projection into the wider world, I would say that it tends to be less well understood in its specifics. And what I want to suggest really in the 15 minutes or so that I'm going to speak today is that there's one very specific area where China's national identity and its ideological sense of nationalism comes from that isn't well known in the Western world or indeed the world outside China itself. And that's China's experience in the Second World War. Now, the Second World War, by definition, is one of the best known historical events in global history. And those of us living in Western Europe, North America, parts of Asia, Japan, indeed, are very aware of that war. But China's role in World War II, about which I wrote a previous book, China's War with Japan, is I think the least well-known theatre of that particular war. So we don't have time to go into the whole history of that, sadly, today. But let me give you a few key statistics that, for those who don't know, might just flag up quite how big a deal China's World War II experience was. China fought longer as an allied power in World War II than any of the other allies. War in China broke out with Japan in 1937 and didn't end until 1945, an 8-year-long conflict. Then we have over 10 million deaths, civilian and military, which China suffered during those years. Something like 100 million Chinese became refugees within their own country during those terrible years as well. And not incidentally, more than 500,000 Japanese troops were held down by Chinese troops for 4.5 years until Pearl Harbor, when the United States and the British Empire came into the war in Asia. And quite often it's assumed that the war in Asia, World War II, starts with Pearl Harbor, but actually it is worth noting that the Chinese were fighting a lot longer before that, before the West came in. So I'm not going to talk more about the history of the war. What I'm going to do is just give you that brief summary to explain that in recent years, China has been talking much more about its wartime experience. And that's why I use this, I hope, slightly intriguing title, China's Good War, to describe it. Good does not refer to the experience of the war, which, as I've explained, was absolutely horrific in every way. It points more to the fact that China is using that point of origin, its victory in the war alongside the British and the Americans in 1945, as a starting point for telling a story about itself, about China today in the world as a moral actor that is changing world order, a world order which was created in 1945 at the end of World War II, just as the United States did the same thing. So we're all used, I think, to the idea in the West that, America, dominant power, wins the war in Asia because of a huge amount of troops and resources put into the war in Asia up to 1945. But we're less used to the idea that China was also part of that process as well. And that's what the Chinese want to tell the rest of the world. So let me give you a few examples of how this manifests itself. This was an event that actually I was in Beijing for myself about 5 years ago, just over 5 years ago, in September 2015. It was a victory parade, as you can tell from this picture, right in the center of Beijing in Tiananmen Square, the most sort of sacred site, you might say, at the heart of China's capital city, in front of the Forbidden City. And this was the first, and so far last occasion, when a parade of this size was held in Tiananmen Square as a way of commemorating an event that isn't directly to do with just the history of the Chinese Communist Party, the ruling party of China, but actually the more broad experience of the Chinese victory in World War II, alongside, of course, the Americans and the British, as I've mentioned. The Americans and the British didn't make much of a show at this particular parade, but various other foreign countries, including Russia, were very much present. So China today has more occasions to commemorate the anniversaries of the end of World War II in a way that simply didn't happen on this sort of scale in most of the period when Chairman Mao was in charge or in the years that followed. Now, one of the reasons for that, and again, this just briefly dips into the history, is that while the Chinese Communist Party were very much involved with winning the war against the Japanese, they were not, as Chinese history sometimes in official versions likes to claim, they were not the only people to fight that war. And in fact, the then ruler of China, Chiang Kai-shek, the head of the nationalist Kuomintang party, actually led most of the armies that took part in the set-piece battles that did the vast majority of the fighting. And because, of course, later in the Chinese Civil War between 1946 and 49, those same nationalists were defeated by the communists, it became very difficult, politically incorrect, you might say, to talk about that Kuomintang nationalist Chiang Kai-shek contribution to the war for many decades after the war itself had ended. And for a whole variety of reasons, one of them being the desire for reunification with Taiwan, where the Chinese nationalists had fled in 1949 at the end of the Civil War. For a whole variety of reasons, it was only in the 1980s that people started in China beginning to hear this fuller history of the war, in which both the nationalists and the communists had a very significant role, and using it to tell this wider story about China's entry into the world as a shaper of world order in 1945, at the end of World War II. One of the people who did that shift was this gentleman here, Hu Qiaomu. If you haven't encountered him, he was a very big theoretician of Chinese communism, very close to Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao, very much a figure of the kind of heart of the ideology of the party. And with his writing in some of the major Chinese ideological newspapers like the People's Daily, he set the path for China to start acknowledging those parts of its wartime history where China had fought back under non-communists, as well as the communists themselves, in this fight against the external enemy, the Japanese. And this process, as I've said, began in the 1980s. Hu Qiaomu read a lot of these kind of essays and helped sponsor a big museum of wartime history, which is still there on the outskirts of Beijing today. If you go and visit it, if you can get to Beijing through the pandemic at the moment. But that was only the beginning. And in the later decades that followed, the 1990s, the 2000s, 2010s, more and more aspects of China's World War II experience started appearing in Chinese diplomatic culture, popular culture, education, textbooks. So let me show you a few examples of how World War II has become threaded through Chinese popular culture in the sense of being part of that sense of nationalist pride that the Chinese have come to feel. So this event here, Cairo Conference, 1943. Now, as you see, two very famous Western figures. In the middle, President Roosevelt of America, and next to him, Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Britain, Prime Minister of the British Empire. But next to him on the left of President Roosevelt, who's looking backwards in this picture, is Chiang Kai-shek. And on the other side, actually, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, his wife, the ruler of China and his very influential and powerful wife at this time. Now, this picture is very important because it shows that China, very early on in 1943, was finally being treated as a kind of equal power with the Americans and the British, at least nominally, in terms of the World War II effort. And that's a story even today you don't hear very much in the West. But of course, the issue is that the Chinese Communist Party today had to change its view of history to allow this very patriotic picture to be circulated, because of course the guy sitting there is Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist and indeed very anti-communist leader of China at the time, and not Chairman Mao, not Mao Zedong. Now, this causes political problems on occasion when this enters the kind of wider political sphere in China. Check out this movie, 2015, called Cairo Declaration. This is a kind of biopic movie version of this same event. So there's the Cairo Conference, the real thing, back in 1943. Here's the movie they made about it just over 70 years later. But you'll see that right in the middle is an actor playing Chairman Mao, who, as you'll see from the previous picture, Mao, not there.
This is a real B&H customer story.
Okay, we checked all 4 systems and keying was a go.
At B&H, we help folks find the products they need. Isn't that right, Irving?
Yeah.
But he's there in the movie, whereas Chiang Kai-shek doesn't really make much of an appearance. The guy in glasses, in case you're wondering, next to the actor of Mao, is an actor playing General He Ying-qin, the head of the nationalist military, but not Chiang Kai-shek himself. I have to say a lot of people on the Chinese internet noticed the absence of Chiang Kai-shek, and also the fact that Chairman Mao was in the movie, even though he wasn't at Cairo in real life, and started producing, as you'll see here, all these kind of started producing parody versions of this poster with other people like Barack Obama and Saddam Hussein, who were also not present at that time. But the wider significance of this movie is that even in popular cultures, even in the movie theaters of China, events surrounding World War II, and not just the events surrounding the Communist Party, even though people like Chairman Mao make a sort of slightly gratuitous appearance, has penetrated the story of China's World War II resistance much more into the national story that China tells about itself. And that manifests itself in all sorts of perhaps slightly unexpected ways. So, for instance, in other aspects, for instance, when about 10 years ago, Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg over in Hollywood produced this HBO TV series called The Pacific about Americans fighting in the Pacific War against the Japanese, the Asian theater of World War II. Well, in exactly the same year, perhaps not deliberately, but in the same time, this much more pro-Chinese, very patriotic movie was released in China, Dongfeng Yu, in which the Chinese contribution to the anti-Japanese war is much more stressed. So every country is, producing popular culture about World War II that suits its own domestic audience. And it's often not realized in the West that China does this just as much as America or Britain or other countries, which still maintain this very strong collective memory of World War II more than 75 years after the war itself actually ended back in 1945. So let me finish off by giving you a couple of examples of where that new interest in World War II as part of China's history and self-definition and national identity has influenced today. So one example is in a maritime dispute that's very well known to many people who look at the geopolitics of the region. China basically makes a big claim to almost all of the South China Sea, these huge waters that are off the coast of China, whereas other countries in the region, the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, make a whole variety of alternative claims saying, no, we actually control parts of this sea. It doesn't all belong to China. Now, I'm not going to make any claims at this point about who's right and who's wrong. That's not my point. My point here is that when China makes its case in international arenas saying, no, it's all Chinese, one of the things they turn to often is this map from 1947, when the then nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek that I mentioned, the previous pre-communist government, was already making what's called an 11-dash line, a kind of statement on a map that actually all of these waters belong to China. And the reason that the nationalists felt able to really push that case at that point was very much because they'd just been victors in this war. Think back, they'd just been fighting next to Winston Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt. They felt that they were now able to rewrite the history of Asia. And what's really ironic and interesting is that using this good war using this idea that China fought valiantly in World War II, which it did, and that China's nationalist government had made a claim. China's communist government today is basically picking up that claim and taking it almost wholesale into the present day. So they are drawing off the back of that post-World War II settlement that the Chinese government at the time wanted to make in the offshore waters of China. So beyond that, you have also a whole variety of different elements of China today seeking to use World War II. And I'll finish perhaps with a statement made by leaders from top down, President Xi Jinping, Foreign Minister Wang Yi. I've heard it myself in at least one occasion, and there are various other places where you hear it. And that's the following statement. Over and over again, China's leaders like to remind the wider world, but particularly the United States, that it was China that in the last days of World War II, in April 1945, was the first signatory to the United Nations Charter. In other words, China is making a sort of statement about its own history. It's saying not just that 1949, victory of Chairman Mao on the mainland, foundation of the People's Republic of China, that's when the new Chinese history starts. They don't abandon that, that's very much there. But at the same time, they're also saying in 1945, at the end of World War II, an event which the British and the Americans and the French think belongs to them. Well, no, China was there as well. China was there at the foundation of the world order. The UN post-1945 order, a phrase which you can find in plenty of newspapers and journals, which exists to the present day. China is a joint owner of that particular order. That is what I go into more detail in my book, China's Good War, which, and I hope I've done a little bit to explain the title. If you're interested, do feel free to check it out and learn a bit more about that. But my overall takeaway, and the one that I'd like to leave you with as we come to perhaps some questions and comments in the next 10 minutes or so, is that there are a lot of things you have to understand if you want to understand China's contemporary nationalism, its economic confidence, it's Marxism-Leninism, it's communism. It's drawing on traditional Chinese history and philosophy. But one aspect that, as I say, I think is under-examined in the wider world, but really important, is China's own collective memory of World War II in diplomacy, in popular culture, in education, and in the mindset of today's Chinese communist leaders who unexpectedly are drawing on a lot of the heritage of their old enemies, the Kuomintang, the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, and combining it with their own history of Chinese communism. That has also created a potent new source from the wartime past of talking about China's present, and indeed, as it looks to take a greater role in the United Nations and a bigger role in the world, about its future as well. So this is not just history, this is very much current affairs as well. All right, I will hand back to Ben with that particular thought. Thanks very much indeed. And we'll be delighted to take any questions and comments that anyone has in our next section.
What the is Air Up? It's the purest drink on the planet. Loved by over 10 million people because it flavors pure water without adding a thing to it. How? By scent. Curious? You should be. Try Air Up at air-up.com.
How this doctor prevents dark spots.
You don't have one spot.
And people look at my hands, they say, oh my gosh, look at your hands.
I have more sunspots than you. What are your tricks?
The lining of your gut is your skin turned inside out, so that what happens on the lining of your gut is reflected in your skin. So if you have a healthy gut lining that's glowing, you'll actually see that on your skin.
The reality is age spots like these are caused by overactive pigment cells in your skin. And if this banana could actually get rid of them, there wouldn't be thousands of people struggling with unwanted discoloration, just like my wife Penny did. For years, she beat herself up over these pesky spots and how much older she thought they might make her look. She tried all the tricks out there. I hated seeing her self-confidence suffer, which is why I made it my personal mission to find a solution. So I dug into the research, and what I found absolutely shocked me. Here we were trying to find a solution no matter the cost, when there was a simple, effective, foolproof, do-it-yourself trick right in front of us. It's made such a difference for Penny, it would feel irresponsible not to share it with the public. So today, I'm showing you how to visibly erase dark spots right from home.
It's the makeup industry's worst nightmare, but it's a godsend for anyone who wants to look younger. a do-at-home age spot solution that works so well, some say they no longer need foundation or concealer.
My dark spots appeared to be magically erased from my face. After trying so many different methods and watching how easily and fast it was happening, it was really strange and kind of emotional, actually, because I feel like they really did add years to my face. I would wake up and seriously be really freaked out because the results were so good.
This unusual age spot solution is not something you can get at the store or from your dermatologist. It's a completely new approach based on the research of Dr. Stephen Gundry. And he's here to show us the easiest way to do it on your own, right at home.
This is something I came up with for my wife, Penny. And now the spots that used
Rana, that was absolutely fantastic. And you'll be unsurprised to hear that the questions have already been flooding in. So do keep those coming in the comments, everyone. But first, I wanted to ask a broad question of my own that I'm surprised I've never asked in our pre-show chat. So I'll take advantage of hosting to do it now. Where did your interest in studying China begin and why?
Thanks, Ben. Well, I studied Chinese as my undergraduate subject at university. So really, I made a decision to go and study Chinese when I was about 16 or 17, which I hasten to add is a very long time ago now. And I think overall, I mean, I've thought about this, over the years, why on earth would this be the case? And all I can say is that back in the late 80s, early 90s, China was not the coming power. It was not the next great global, engine of economic growth or military might. It was actually, in some ways, for anyone living in Britain, a rather obscure sort of place that nobody knew much about. And so I think, in a sense, the fact that it was remote, the fact it was challenging, the fact it had this incredibly difficult seeming language that I wanted to get to grips with, it was the unfamiliar rather than the significant that really drew me into it. It ended up being rather significant. China, not me, I hasten to add. But it's certainly been a very rewarding place to study for a long time since then.
I'm sure. There are 1,000 more questions I want to ask off the back of that, but I will give our audience a turn. So the first, I think, start with an interesting one from Jenny on Facebook. Should we in the West stop saying 1939 to 1945 to describe World War II?
Absolutely. In fact, I would recommend that, being at home, I can do this here. The previous book, you will see, if I've got the right bit of the top of the thing there, that my dating of China's World War II indeed is very specifically 1937 to 45. I have long believed that, in fact, if you're talking about the World War, then essentially that comes in the summer of 1941, when the German invasion of the Soviet Union basically expands what's then a European war, and sets the stage for bringing in the wider powers. And then, of course, Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 brings the United States into the war against Japan, and then Hitler declares war on Germany. So both sides cross over. Until that time, you can argue there's one Asian war and there's one European war. The European war has the empires behind it, you could say. But from that moment, it's a world war, and that process starts just outside Beijing in 1937.
Yeah. That's really interesting. We have a whole series of questions coming in about the relationship between China and the US and the similarities between the two. So I'll pick a couple.
Sure.
I think are really interesting. Okay, let's go for Stu on Twitter. Would you draw comparisons between the way that China talks about its role in World War II and the way that Britain talks about its role in the same war?
I absolutely, not only would I do, if you were to get a hold of a copy of China's Good War, and I hope you do, page 1 actually makes a reference to, and again, I think only Brits watching this, but there are a few of you will perhaps get this, to the TV show Dad's Army, which, it's repeated, to this day on Saturday evenings on British TV, 40 or 50 years after it was made and 75 years after the wartime events that it depicts. It's still part of British popular culture in a huge way. Everything in Britain is World War II. Brexit, World War II, COVID, World War II. When Her Majesty the Queen spoke about the pandemic, she ended with the words, "We'll meet again," referencing Dame Vera Lynn. So what I'm trying to get over to non-China, Chinese people will know this very well. There may be someone on this call. So, 你们好, 我很高兴你现在和我们在一起. But for those who are not from China, I would say, understanding that China too has this World War II element running through huge amounts of its popular culture and its diplomacy is something we really need to get to grips with. The easiest way to do it, if you go to China, is to turn on television and see just how many World War II dramas are still shown on national television. And a lot of them, perhaps more a few years ago than now, but a lot of them actually focus on the nationalists, the Chinese nationalists, who were actually anti-communists. And that's a sign that there's been a broadening of some of the historical perspective in China as well, although that's been slightly tamped down in recent years.
Okay. We have a whole load here on education and people perhaps claiming they weren't taught enough at school. Perhaps the best that sums it up is Tim here on Facebook. While China has a nationalist reason to stress its contribution to World War II, are there areas where the Western public really ought to know more about that theatre of war? And Christine also echoes that should this kind of history be taught more in UK schools? What would your perspective be on that?
The short answer is absolutely yes, and we haven't got huge amounts of time, so I'll just give one example, but I think it's a good one, because it's the one I quite often use to make people think. Essentially, when people do know that China, played a part in World War II, they generally tend to, if they've read the general history, dismiss it as sort of marginal. It wasn't very important. It was a weak and corrupt power, didn't do much. And, by the end of the war, that's certainly true in terms of much that went on. I don't want to, sort of glamorize the Chinese war effort. But I point people to one particular year, 1938, which of course traditionally isn't considered part of World War II if you start in 1939. But if you start in 1937, it's a year into the war between China and Japan. Supposing China, meaning both the Chiang Kai-shek nationalists and the communists, both of whom fought against the Japanese, had decided to surrender at that time, as most foreign diplomats, including the Brits, thought that they would do. I mean, there's some quite fruity correspondence from the Foreign Office I've got in one of my books, which is, why don't the Chinese just surrender quickly and then British business interests can get back on, back in line, which strikes me as a little cynical. But they didn't. They kept fighting against tremendous odds. If they had not done, if they had made a deal, as in fact Wang Jingwei, who was the kind of equivalent of Laval or Pétain, the collaborator with the Japanese, as he had wanted at that time, then basically China would have become a sort of Japanese colony, I think, really, for years, maybe decades to come. If China had been pacified, then actually you never get Pearl Harbor. If you don't, well, not in that way. If you don't get Pearl Harbor, you don't get a world war. That means it's probably harder for the Americans to come into the war either in Asia or in Europe. So actually, China fighting on in 1938 is not just important for China, although of course eventually it is. It actually affects the whole trajectory of what we think of as a sort of natural history of World War II, in which Europe sits at the center. The European war would have been different if China had behaved differently in 1938. And those of us who are glad about the result, which I hope is all of us watching this, should be more grateful, I think, to the Chinese war effort on that behalf.
Well, that's a case that's hard to argue against. I look forward to the curriculums changing immediately.
We'll do our best.
I know you have to shoot soon, so let's squeeze in maybe two more.
Sure. Okay. Please. Yep.
Apologies to Will, who asked a very good question about US movies, but I'm going to go for Paolo on YouTube, who asked, to what extent do you think Chinese wartime history is impacting on, say, China and Hong Kong and China and the Philippines geopolitical tensions today?
Good question. By the way, do slip in the one about movies after, because I love movies. I'll talk about a lot of them in the book, so we've definitely got time for that one. But on the question of education, one of the things that I do think is disturbing, which is happening, which already happened in the mainland of China, and which is happening in Hong Kong to some extent now, and I hope it doesn't go too far, is the attempt to try and impose a very top-down version of history. So one thing I should say is that the subtlety and the nuance that I've mentioned, explaining that some non-communists had a really important role, these Chinese Kuomintang nationalists, you'll find that in a lot of places, including movies, and actually all the academic histories in China talk about it. It's less easy to find in the school textbooks, which are much more simplistic and push much more a historical line that only the communists really played an important role. And don't get me wrong, the communists did play an important role. I'm not one of those people, and there are some who say they did nothing. That's not true at all. But they did it as part of an alliance. And I think Hong Kong, which for the moment, even now, still has much more range in terms of what history you can study, I would be concerned if the educational curriculum there switches to a very top-down nationalist one that argues only the Chinese Communist Party and only one interpretation of wartime history is valid. Because if that's the case, then China goes into these arguments with the Philippines and elsewhere with this very monolithic and actually in many ways inaccurate history. And my own plea, not least to China, would be there's nothing to be afraid of from actually having the subtlety and the complications of real history as opposed to propaganda history. Propaganda in the end doesn't really get you anywhere. But do ask the question about the movies then.
Okay, I will. Right, well, quickly then, Will, you've got your question. Will says that there are blockbuster US movies that are made with the full cooperation of the US government. Is the Chinese approach to historical movies really any different?
I would say that in some ways, the Chinese blockbuster movies, both for the most part, have to pass through a formal censorship process in China, which obviously doesn't operate in the United States, even though commercial pressures, as you were indicating, I think, do push it in directions often which are, don't be rude about China or you won't get a Chinese release. But I would point out, and again, I do point out, as I keep saying in the book, there are at least several big blockbuster Chinese movies that actually skirted up pretty far against the boundaries of political correctness. So last year's big hit, $300 million at the Chinese box office, the 800, is actually about the heroism of nationalist, not communist soldiers in a last stand against the Japanese in Shanghai, not communist to be seen anywhere in the entire film. So, the film was actually banned for a while, but then it was released and was a big hit. So it shows there's a demand for this sort of thing. And one other example, the film Back to 1942, released in 2012, directed by Fang Xiaogang, sometimes called the Steven Spielberg of China. Many people noticed the metaphor about a wartime famine caused by the nationalists could be used as a not very subtle metaphor for the famine of the Great Leap Forward in the 1950s caused by the communists under Mao. And so, there's a certain amount of political usage and even, sharp comment going on under the surface of what looks like a sort of big, loud blockbuster movie.
Yeah, I can see some more about movies coming in, but we don't have time, I'm afraid, everyone. So I'll go to our last question. From Sally, who is asking you to look into the future. She asks, as an American, I'd be interested to know whether you think this China versus the US narrative is likely to continue far into the future.
I'm afraid I think it is. I think the conference that's just happened in Alaska over the last 24 to 48 hours is indicative of the level of language we're likely to see between the two. But I will put a slightly more optimistic note. As far as I understand, the last couple of years of the Trump administration, there was very little direct contact at all between most senior people in Beijing and between the administration in Washington. And I think robust and even quite rude conversations going on is better than silence, because silence means that actually both sides have no idea what the other side is up to. And getting in the room, even if it's a somewhat kind of turbulent room, is always better, I think, than, trying to second or third guess the other side. So I think while we're expecting a pretty robust relationship between the two countries for some time to come, I think it's immensely important that they keep talking. And therefore, in a weird way, actually, that encounter was actually a positive in some ways rather than purely a negative.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rana. I know that's all we have time for, so we'll end it there. So huge thanks again. That was a fascinating talk. And thank you also on behalf of yourself, Tom and Greg behind the scenes, and me, to our audience for taking part in not just this, but the whole of our second series of Oxford at Home. From the comments you've sent in over the last few broadcasts, it sounds like you've really enjoyed watching them. We've definitely enjoyed making them, so thank you. If you've missed one or two of our broadcasts and want to watch any of those talks back, we travelled to a range of places throughout the series, from Shakespeare in England to Finland to Mars. Just search for Oxford at Home to find our website, and they're all on there. You can watch them all back. So thanks again, and wherever you are in the world, we hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.